It all started a week ago. Someone put a timeout doll at our local playground. If you're not familiar, they're life-size dolls that look like children in timeout or playing hide and seek. They lean face first against the wall, hiding their faces with their hands. You only ever see the back of them. Some are handmade, using old kids' clothes, a hat, a wig, and some straw for stuffing. The first time I saw one at the playground, I thought it was a real kid. So did my 5-year-old. He went up to the thing and asked, "Want to play hide and seek?" It didn't move. I watched from the bench, fear sinking in. Why isn't that kid moving? He, or she, it was hard to tell from the longish blonde hair and bucket hat, was leaned against the green plastic tunnel that Ryan liked to crawl through. Just standing there, totally still. But as I approached, I saw the plasticky shine of its curly blonde hair, the snow-white neck poking out from the shirt's collar. I raised my hand and, slowly, gave it a poke. It wobbled against the tunnel. It's a doll. My stomach dropped. Is this someone's idea of being cute? It felt like something an 80-year-old granny would do. The type that likes Precious Moments figurines and buys those hyper-realistic baby dolls. Or maybe it's a prank. I could see a group of teenagers leaving it here, just to freak out parents. Maybe they hide in the bushes and film people's reactions and put it on their TikTok or something. Either way, it creeped me out. Just standing there, totally still, leaned up against the tunnel like that. Its face lined up perfectly with one of the circular holes cut into the tunnel wall, like it was peering inside. "What is it?" Ryan asked, staring at it. "It's a doll. They call them timeout dolls, because they look like they're in timeout," I replied. "Oh." Then he got on his hands and knees and, before I could stop him, scooted into the tunnel. "Ryan." "Hi," he said, his voice echoing in the plastic. "Do you want to play?" "Come on." "It has no face." "Why does it have no face?" "Come on, get out of there," I said, the uneasiness in my stomach growing. He finally popped his head out and smiled at me. "Can we make sandcastles?" "Sure," I replied. I hated making sandcastles, getting sand all over my jeans. But it was loads better than dealing with this creepy doll. A few days later, when we went back to the playground, it was still there. The after-school crowd was there, running up the jungle gym and racing down the slides. But there was one child that was standing still among the commotion, that stupid doll. It was in the same place as before, leaned against the tunnel. I whipped around, half expecting to see some giggling teenagers filming us. But there were only tired zombie parents glued to their phones, chaotic kids racing across the mulch. I went back to my phone, scrolling through the news. When I looked up a minute later, the doll was in a different place. It was now leaned up against the slide, hiding its face against the green plastic. My heart sank. One of the kids must have moved it, I thought. I glanced around, at all the screeching, whooping kids. "Right?" I waved to Ryan, about to go down the slide, and put my phone away. I didn't want to take my eyes off him anymore. He waved back, grinning toothily, his bright yellow hat sticking out among the crowd. But there's always something to distract us from our kids. Dirty dishes in the sink, unread emails, there's always something tugging at our sleeve, crying for our attention. And for me, today, it was a phone call. As I answered my client's questions about the logo and branding images I designed for her, my eyes strayed from the playground. And when I looked back, I couldn't see Ryan anymore. I dropped the phone and stood up. "Ryan." "Nothing." I ran around the side of the playground, and that's when I saw his yellow hat. Not on Ryan. On that fucking timeout doll. It was now leaned against the rock climbing wall. Hands covering its face. Shirt softly rippling in the wind. Blonde, shiny curls poking out from my son's hat. My blood ran cold. Animalistic fear pounded through my veins. This is wrong. So wrong. I opened my mouth to scream for Ryan. We switched hats. I whipped around to see Ryan standing there. Perfectly fine, wearing the doll's bucket hat. I let out a breath. sunk to my knees. "Thank God you're okay," I said, voice warbling, pulling him in for a hug. "I'm okay," he replied, confused. "Can we go on the swings?" "Okay. But first, let's switch your hats back." Barely looking at the wretched doll, I reached over and yanked off the yellow hat. "Put its hat back on," I told him, and then we made our way to the swings. I spent a while there, just pushing him, enjoying the sunny, if cold, spring day. The tension began to melt away. Ryan was safe, and everything was fine. Eventually, as the sun began to set, we made our way back to the parking lot. As I mentally thought through the steps of preparing dinner, I needed to cut up some carrots, and did we remember to buy heavy cream? Ryan tugged at my sleeve. "Why is it there?" "No. The doll." It was now at the edge of the parking lot, leaning against a tree. One of the kids must have moved it out here." "Why?" "They probably thought it was funny." "Come on, let's go." We quickly got in the car and drove home. That night, I decided we'd go to a different playground for a few days. The doll was freaking me out too much. Yeah, maybe it was irrational, but no one said we had to go to that playground. I'd take him to the one in Edgewood tomorrow. As I put Ryan's hat away, I noticed several strands of curly blonde hair stuck inside. Actually, more than several. I pulled them out, my stomach turning a little, and then threw them in the trash. Then I sat down, settled in, and took a sip of tea. Just as I was finally relaxing, I heard Ryan's voice upstairs. "Mom." I dropped the cup of tea and ran up the stairs. "Mom. Mom," he continued yelling, fear threading his voice. I burst into the room. Ryan was cowering in the corner of his bed, covers up to his neck. "It's in my closet," he whispered. "What's in your closet?" I asked, fear pounding through me. "The doll." "No. It's got to be a nightmare." I paced towards the closet. The door was ajar, the darkness spilling out of it. With each step my heart sank further. It can't be, just a nightmare. I sucked in a breath and swung the door open. No. It wasn't a nightmare. There, in the darkness, stood the timeout doll. It was leaned against the hanging clothes, pressing its face into Ryan's shirts. Its blonde curls shone softly in the darkness. I raced over to Ryan and picked him up out of bed. "We're getting out of here," I said, charging out of the room and towards the stairs. It wasn't a possessed doll. Those don't exist. Someone had put the doll there, which meant someone was in our house. Mark, it could be Mark. Some sort of sick, twisted way to get back at me for getting the house and the settlement. Did he still have the keys? I raced down the stairs, Ryan bobbing with each step. When I got to the landing, I glanced back. No. The doll was at the top of the stairs, now. Face pressed into the wall. I raced to the front door. Grabbed the doorknob, yanked it open. Glanced back. The doll was on the landing. And was that a shadow next to it? Someone standing there? I ran across the front yard, towards the neighbor's house. I pounded on the door, crying. "Let me in. Someone broke into our house. Please." As I took a final glance at our house, I saw the doll leaned against the oak tree in our front yard. The police didn't find anything. No doll, no evidence of a break-in. With nothing to go on, they left, telling me they'd call if they got in touch with Mark. Ryan and I are staying at a friend's house for a few days, while we get our bearings and try to figure out what's going on here. But I'm worried. Because last night, when I went to check on Ryan to see if he was asleep yet, I found an empty bed. Ryan was standing in the corner of the room, leaning against the wall, hands over his face. "What are you doing?" I whispered, tugging at his arm. "Go back to bed. Now." He turned towards me, hands still pressed against his eyes. "He isn't in timeout, Mommy," he said. I stopped in my tracks. "What?" "He's playing hide and seek," he continued. "Now he's hiding, and it's my turn to seek. My grandfather was a simple man. He worked for the newspaper company every week since he was 12 years old, only taking off for his father's funeral, the birth of his eldest daughter, and to fight in Vietnam. He married my grandmother after the war in a white clapboard chapel in a rented suit. He collected early American history memorabilia. He believed in God. When Grandma died, he got a bit more social. Called sometimes. Asked me what I was learning in history. Mom said it was because he was lonely. As I got older, though, I became something of a history buff myself, and I think Granddad connected with that. He would show me all these letters he had collected over the years, letters that the earliest of settlers had written to each other and back home when they were trying to establish towns that would survive. Jamestown. Roanoke. They were fascinating. When Granddad died, he left all those letters in 2 boxes. He had planned, organized everything so it would be easy for us. He had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's and had never faced an enemy he couldn't shoot, so that's exactly what he did. He stared down his plaque-ridden brain in the mirror during a moment of lucidity and shot it with his .45. The 2 boxes were labeled, "Donate to your museum" and "For Carrie." Almost everything was in the museum donation box, which I thought was only right since they were priceless artifacts. Mom already had the Smithsonian on the line. In my box, though, the things he had passed along for Carrie, there were 2 letters, and one was from him. _ Dear Carrie, if you are reading this, I am dead, and I hope it's not too hard on you or your mom. The other letters I left you were given to me by a friend in the auction circuit, and he picked them up for me in an antique shop. The owner gave them out for free, the bastard. I realize I am burdening you with this knowledge, but it has to go on to somebody, and I know your brothers, God love them, couldn't cut it. But you know the horrors this country was founded on, and you can be trusted to do what's needed when they come back. When I got back from Nam, I went looking for a reason to believe in America. I found this instead. Love. Granddad. _ Needless to say, I was spooked and intrigued. Maybe a little numb from the week's grief and chaos. I folded up the letters in my pocket and threw away the box they came in. The rest went to the Smithsonian. I went back to my room and read everything, stayed up for hours. At first, I thought they were the ramblings of a demented and lonely old man. Then I figured they were fakes, hoaxes that were just believed by a demented and lonely old man. Parts of it read like a PBS special on the settlers, the others like a horror movie. These things, surely, could not be real. I didn't learn these things in school. 1. April 7, 1606. It is a gray day. All morning it has rained, and the men are weary and in foul spirits. The ground here is soft and wet, giving way underfoot like it does in Scotland, only the air swarms with the most pestilent insect that makes us itch and groan during the nights. The native peoples do not go to the place we seek. They describe it using a word our interpreter says has no direct translation, but whenever they speak of it, they wait to blacken cobs of corn or rotten fish, dead things that fall to decay and stench. I bear no ill will towards these natives. I think them only a superstitious group, like the Scots. Perhaps it's the wet ground. 3 of my men perished last night. They did not have the same fever as the others, who suffered from horrible aches and sweats until they collapsed, but simply did not wake up in the morning after appearing strong and healthy yesterday. We found their mouths wide open and fixed in crooked screams, which has bothered the others. They begin to speak of a curse, to whisper about what the natives said. They point out to me that the roots of the trees here are thicker and blacker, and that the animals are dying. There are no birds or fish or mice, only the accursed insects. I have nothing to say to this, other than that if the land is not wanted by the natives, it is uncontested, and therefore we would be fools not to accept what Providence has shown us. I tell them the king will appreciate our efforts, and I hope it is true, but these are dark waters. Jim McAllister. Of course, I spent hours Googling Jim McAllister settler. I baffled over the date 1606 when the first American settlement, Jamestown, was supposedly not created until 1607. There were no results. It seemed like just another doomed early expedition. 2. April 9, 1606. At last we have reached the place of burning, as the natives call it. I I do not know why. It is lush with forest plants and trees and as damp as everything else we have seen. We have called it Richtown because we hope for riches in the name of King James. Still, there are no animals around. Our livestock continue to die. When they do, they are so skinny that there is no significant amount of meat to take from them, and when we cut them open, any meat we find is foul and stinking anyway. 7 more men have died as well. Our numbers have reduced to 23, and the women. To my shame, the women have had to work in the labors of men, carrying lumber and helping to build houses. It is not right, but we must do what we can to survive in this strange land. We have begun to clear land and fell trees to build, and we need not make walls for there are no other people and no animals. But at night, we all hear the howling. It is like no wolf I have ever encountered, but like a mother who has lost her babe. I fear it is a banshee, and tell the men not to wander when the sun sets. Still, no beast comes for our remaining pigs or cows. Only the sickness that has taken the rest of them. Poor Beth Lyons is with child and due any day now, and I fear the babe will surely not live to see the summer. It is foolish on Patrick to have brought her along. I do not know what we will do once the last of the livestock perishes, for there is not one deer or squirrel or bird here to sustain us. Jim McAllister. I went to a conservationist, one of those experts in old things, and showed him just the first 2 letters to see if they were real. He raised an eyebrow at the content, asked me a few times where I got it, to which I replied a few times some vague story about collecting memorabilia, then said he'd send it to get carbon dated for me. When the results came back, the conservator handed them to me with a pale face and suspicious eyes. The carbon dating of the paper on which the letter was written went back to about 1580 to 1620. That put 1606 right smack in the middle and likely accurate, so I knew I was dealing with something real, not a hoax. Not dementia. But the strange thing was that the chemical analysis of the letters revealed levels of sulfur 120 times normal background levels. I couldn't find any reason for this in my research, nor could I find record of a place of burning or a strange disease that killed off animals and people. I managed to dig up a record of an expedition to the New World from around that time headed by a James McAllister, but it was listed by the English writers at the time as lost. 3. April 14, 1606. This is a horrid place. No animal dares to set foot in our small town, and those we have brought ourselves are all dead now, their meat blackened and useless. All day, it smells of smoke and of rotten eggs. We are hungry. I have written to the governor in England and pleaded for him to send supplies, but it will be months before such things can arrive, and we have thus far been unable to plant crops. The ground is too wet. All we have are the roots that grow naturally here, thick and tuberous things that taste of nothing but bitterness, and make us tired and sluggish the rest of the day. Beth Lyons gave birth last night. The babe was born with black eyes, no whites. His skin was gray like that of a fish, and he screamed and screamed from the moment he came out, not in the desperate, wailing way that infants do, but almost in rage. Beth would not speak, and would not hold it. Patrick says he doesn't want the child in his house. He put it in the cradle and said the boy stared at him. When I went to see it, the child had its mouth wide open like the corpses of our men who had died from the illness, and its eyes were full of hatred. I swear before Christ that it spoke to me, in the voice of a man, or rather, of many men, and said this: "Foolish son of Adam, I will feast on your marrow. I will devour your soul as I devour all children of flesh. This infant shall be neither the first nor the last." Beth started to scream and has not stopped. Her laughed, then began to scream as well. We took it out and have placed it in the church we built, hoping the house of God could drive out whatever evil resided in it, or at least contain it. This morning, we found Beth dead. Patrick had killed her, to stop the screaming, then shot himself. The baby continues to cry and nobody, not even Father Noah, will enter the church. I pray God deliver us from this terror, but I fear with each day that God does not reside here. Jim McAllister. Virginia Dare, of course, was supposed to be the first white child born on American soil. This, I realized with a chill, thinking of the word lost and the way the English wrote it blithely on records of this expedition, was because no one survived to tell the baby boy born to poor Beth and Patrick Lyons, whoever they were. Son of Adam. A crude and ancient way of meaning human. So what inhabited the baby was not the same. I looked up Richtown and found a brief English record of the letter McAllister had sent pleading for help. Richtown, in present-day North Carolina. 4. April 16, 1606. Burning. It is all on fire all the time and the houses are gone. We sleep on the ground now, as pigs, and listen. Father Noah talks of God, but the infant talks of flesh and hunger. He says that we shall be fed if we listen to the howl. The howl calls to all. Do we know? Have I known all along? This is, perhaps, not the right place to be. The natives are superstitious but correct. Revelations 13:1 And I saw the beast rising out of the sea, with 10 horns and 7 heads. And I saw the beast rising out of the sea, with 10 horns and 7 heads. And I saw the beast rising out of the sea, with 10 horns and 7 heads. And I saw the beast rising out of the sea, with 10 horns and 7 heads. And I saw the beast rising out of the sea, with 10 horns and 7 heads. And I saw the beast rising to talk Hesiod and horns and 7 heads, 7 heads, 7 heads, 7 heads, 7 heads, 7 heads. J.J. McAllister. So I went to North Carolina, because I'm an idiot with no self-preservation and terminally curious. I did not show the letters, but I asked about the doomed settlement of Richtown, and a few old men who chewed tobacco and looked me up and down with skeptical frowns pointed me west. And west and west. One historian I ran into told me to wait before going further, said he'd contact a woman who knew more, who could talk to me. When she came, her face was ashen, and the first thing she told me was to go home. What you are looking for is hidden for a reason, she said. As long as this land has existed, wise people have avoided. Only dead people have sought it out. What does Revelations 13:1 have to do with it? I pressed. If it's been around since before the Christian settlers, why does it reference the Christian God? It has nothing to do with God, she snapped. With any God, of any people. It uses what you know, because it is the voice of the end. If you listen to it, the end will come. Before settlers ever came to these lands, the native people burned a ring around its home to mark the land as forsaken, and because fire kept it contained. They warned people, including McAllister, never to go in. Whatever you read in those letters was not meant to be found. It is the very reason why the expedition is dead. Where is it? Stupid girl. I will not be a part of your suicide. My grandfather gave me these letters. I think he wanted me to find it. Then he wanted you dead. Perhaps the whole world with you. Have you read them all? Well, do not try to find that place until you've read every letter. -5. 536, 536, 536. Destruction. Once, it roamed far across these lands. The Norsemen came and brought part of it back to Europe, and it gorged itself. The people here have trapped it since then, and it starves, it aches for us. It brings the end, and we fall before it. We can do nothing else. We ate Father Noah. The infant told us to. He tasted of smoke and pig. I savored the salt in his blood. It is a sin, but so is hunger. God is not here, God is not here, God is not here. We cannot cross the line of fire like it tells us to. It wants us to roam free once more so that it can leave here and eat more of them. I think this is not good, but I cannot think of why. I do not know who I am anymore, only that I once prayed to a God that said I would be saved. Save me from this then, God. We will not leave. I am in charge of the others, so I have killed them. At night, I have gone through and slit their throats. This way, no one will leave. This has angered it. The infant screams louder and I cannot sleep because of the howl, which tells me I will never sleep again. I stood before a line in the dirt turned black from fire. It looked like it had been burned again and again and again. On all the trees in the area, there were signs that read "Do not enter" or "Caution" or things in an old language I didn't know. Closer to the old town, the words scribbled there became more sunken into the bark, older, and before me then I saw the same words McAllister rambled in the letters, 7 heads, 7 heads, 7 heads. Hunger. 536. There lay the town, just beyond the black line in the dirt that still smelled like smoke, as though it had just been lit yesterday. The buildings had crumbled but not decayed, and no plants had grown over them. I couldn't hear a single bird. In the tree to my left, there was a name carved in with a knife, Judd Pryor. My grandfather. From 1975, there were dates under his name spanning every 7 years. 1982, 1989. 1996, 2003. 2010, 2017. And after that, nothing. I took a deep breath and set down the gasoline can, unscrewed the cap. And I began to pour. -6. Brings madness, it does. I know the madness has me, but I have lit a fire and it shrieks in fury. I burned around the whole town to keep it in. It dies with me. I leave these letters under a rock beyond the line of fire, so that someday someone might know what happened to me, whoever I am. It steals my mind. Whatever I shall write after this is not myself. J. The native people who still live here do a lot to keep people away from the town. They were the ones who first uncovered the letters when they went looking for the settlers who they warned to stay away. Though they could not read the English writing, they kept them until they encountered the would-be settlers of Roanoke, who read the contents and got too curious, got too close. Only one colonist of that ill-begotten town escaped, living in the woods, coming back every 7 years to maintain the fire line around Richtown to keep it contained. But it is not contained. Not quite. When I went in 2024 to burn the line once again and continue what my grandfather had done, I saw a gap. It was about as wide as a man and perfectly clean, perfectly straight. I don't know what or who made it, but I could tell from the way the hair stood up on the back of my neck that it had escaped. And that is why I'm passing the knowledge to you, so you know what is out there. What lives in this land. Richtown and Roanoke are only symptoms of the disease, and you have to be ready. If you hear the howl, don't listen. -7. Listen. Son of Adam. Daughter of Eve. Child of flesh. I know your tongue as I know every tongue. I know your heart because I have tasted it, ripped it with my teeth. You are nothing but salt and iron. The fool thought he could outsmart me with fire, like the wretched people of this land who imprison me. Fire on the surface is not fire in the heart of the ground, so I will bury myself into the heart. I shall lock him away and poison the dirt, spread the poison up along this coast, then west, until the whole thing is rotten. And you will know me. In time, you will. I will feast on your marrow. I will eat it all. When the time comes, you will know. When you hear the howl, listen for me. Jim McAllister. I'm an old man nowadays, and the events described within this text took place a long time ago. Still, I haven't been able to move forward. Not really. Fragmented memories pop up from time to time. Images of that awful night, sporadically haunting me. Seeing as I'm not long for this earth by now, the Grim Reaper impatiently waiting, I figured putting it all into writing would make my last couple of months more comfortable. In some way. Growing up, we had a house like any other. It was red, the pigments of the paint originating from the iron mines further up north. The corners and the casings of the windows were white. A big plot of land surrounded our home, and it included a barn constructed in the same traditional style as the main residence. Miles of pine bordered the property to the north, and fields of wheat and rye to the east. A small gravel path, no wider than an L, connected us to the outside world. If you haven't figured it out yet, we led a quaint and isolated life. But it was good. It was a good life. I apologize, I'm forgetting myself. It becomes less rare with age. I suppose you are wondering what I mean when I say we. A family of 4, plus change, that's who we were. My younger sister Ingrid was a gifted artist. She would start her creative journey making dolls out of straw and drawing on the walls, much to the dismay of her parents. In many ways her spirit was unbound by the realities of life, which I've always admired. My father was your typical farmer, seemingly always armed with a sickle. Most days he wore a hat made out of straw and jean suspenders. So much so that some folk came to call him Kofaser, a direct translation of cowboy with ironic undertones. He was strong-willed and cared for his family. Despite the complex relationship we had, I realized with time that he had to shoulder a burden heavier than any man should have to carry. Then we have my mother, who was a kind and gentle woman, but she was never afraid to bring out her fierceness when haggling during intense negotiations. I remember one time at the local market when she managed to convince our nearest neighbor that the cow we were selling had magical powers. Needless to say, we ate well that week. That may sound strange, but such was rural life back then. Fays, elves, and trolls weren't merely folklore. People gave gifts to these supposed forest dwellers and asked them to bless their crops. When the harvest turned out bountiful, they would thank the beings. When it didn't, they would ask what angered them. I reckon most of it boiled down to superstition. Flawed ways of explaining the unexplained. The lone exception was that of our last couple family members. When Father spoke of them around us, he called them helpers, because that's what they were. Most of the time. Whenever he thought we weren't around, when the late hour struck and darkness would creep into our house, he would quietly call them Vater. A more fitting denomination. The word itself translates to goblin, but it doesn't feel right to call them that. Whites. They were the whites of the land. It was easy to understand as a child. In essence, they assisted us with menial tasks around the property in exchange for porridge, fruits, and pretty trinkets, which my dear sister gladly crafted. Or rather, that's the story our mother told us when we were too young to know about the darker side of the arrangement. One day Ingrid and I found ourselves deep in the forest. Tall trees older than our country rose towards the sky from mossy beginnings. Even though the sun shone bright, its rays couldn't pierce those ancient giants. We had been playing something we came up with, helpers and herders. It was silly, as any game conjured in the mind of a child. One of us started as a cow and the other a herder. The cow would run buck wild due to a particularly bad case of mad cow disease. Of course, the distraught herder would be left with no other option than to seek assistance from the famous helpers. A gift to the imaginary helpers later, usually a pine cone fashioned into an animal, the cow would be cured. My sister mooed emphatically, or so I thought. That was incredible. Do it again, I said. I don't think that was me, she replied. Turns out we had heard a real cow, which prompted an exploration. We moved through thick shrubbery, never minding tiny scrapes from thorns unseen. The cow made another sound, but this time it was far closer. However, it was less of a humble moo and more of a piercing shriek. Poor thing was in pain. We huddled together on the ground and crawled into a bush. Through it we saw the source of the sound. The cow lay bloodied in the center of a circle made out of separate stones. If memory serves me right, it was 5 or 6. I won't go into much further detail about the state of the cow, but it was bad. My young sister had never seen such brutality and let out a gasp. The gasp turned into sniffling and sniffling turned into crying. I tried to hush her, but someone had already heard us. What followed was the berating of the century. Father had never been as angry with us as he was then. Since I was the elder sibling, most of it was directed my way. He dragged me by the arm all the way back home while muttering furious nothings. My sister walked by his side, still in shock from the grisly sight. I didn't listen to what he said, or shouted for that matter. All I could think about was my father standing over the cow, crimson-draped sickle in hand, dancing a terrible dance. The blood and the white shimmer of the blade reminded me of our house. I never saw my father in the same way again. Later that night, when the initial emotion had simmered down, I tried asking some questions. Both of my parents were on the defensive, but soon I wore them down. Apparently, I was finally old enough to know the secrets of the whites. Mother took Ingrid upstairs. Father sat me down at the kitchen table, candlelight flickering in his face. What you saw was a sacrifice, Father said. A sacrifice? Yes. Like the porridge we put on the windowsill, or the dolls your sister makes. But sometimes they demand more. Why? I do not know. There are many things we do not know about them. We know that they are intrinsically linked to this land because they have lived here longer than any man. We know that they tolerate us, even help us, because we bring them gifts. We know that they respect us, as long as we respect them and the land we borrow. He went on for a while, detailing the many tenets of living with whites. You weren't supposed to disturb their paths, for example. A rule made more difficult by the fact that their roads were invisible and ever-changing. You could never deny a white a wish outright, but thankfully they weren't very demanding usually, and it always came with the reward of a plowed field or milked cows. As he continued explaining, I started connecting the dots. It was not possible for my aging father to run the farm all by himself. It was almost a miracle our family had prospered the way we did. Except it wasn't a miracle, after all. He thanked me for listening and told me that I now was in the know, which meant more responsibility from now on. I was content with his answers and started walking up the stairs when a thought hit me. Father, what do they look like? He turned to face me, quickly. His face looked almost drained of color. The flickering of the light highlighted his wrinkles in a way that made him seem much older than he was. Go to bed, son. A while after that fateful conversation, my mother fell ill. Tuberculosis, the doctor said. The White Death. She spent much of her time at the hospital. We visited her often, bringing small trinkets for her. My sister was inconsolable and she entered into deep sadness, spending many a day locked away in her room. This meant that my father and I had to do most of the work around the farm by ourselves. Early mornings and late nights for months. It was taxing work, especially for a growing teenager and his elder. There were positives though. I would say I turned into a man around this time, and I got closer to my usually distant father. Also, we weren't completely alone. The whites were a godsend during this period, and much of my work focused on keeping them happy. Father eased me in, initiated me slowly. Sometimes I missed the mark, which would lead to tools, or even cattle going missing. They could be mischievous, he had told me. Whenever my sins got too egregious, I would hear the pitter-patter of small feet on the roof in the dead of night. Windows being opened. Whispers in a language I didn't recognize from the woods. And always, just outside my field of view, I would sense dark figures hiding. These unspoken threats felt drenched in hatred and spite, far removed from the benevolent beings my father had described. But I suspected they were capable of more than harmless pranks, and by the way father had reacted when I asked about their appearance, he did too. Eventually I got the hang of things. The farm ran smoothly on the shoulders of two men and their army of hidden benefactors. Calculations were made and we concluded that the annual harvest would cover almost all of our expenses for 2 years. At the same time, my mother finally came home from the hospital. Ingrid was overjoyed. I never told anyone that I often snuck out at night, bringing lavish gifts to the whites. Ornate silver brooches I had stolen. Golden earrings and bracelets. All of it went to the stone circle in the forest. I did not ask them for riches or a pretty girl to fall in love with. I just wanted my mother to survive. During all my trips to the sacrificial altar, I never once did see them, but they provided nonetheless. I always imagined them the way tradition had painted them for me, a small, quite chubby, happy fellow with a little hat on. Then again, a sinister energy had befallen the farm despite the many good things happening. I didn't dare imagining them anymore. Our luck would soon run out. The first horror to rear its ugly head was the disappearance of Mother. It was an ordinary day. My father and I woke up at the first crow of the rooster. A fresh layer of snow covered the path to the barn yonder, which made the trek difficult and miserable. I had recently gotten a new pair of boots, 2 layers of leather and a thick layer of wool inside, but the cold still bit my feet. Father grimaced as we struggled against wind and snow. "Today, you become a man," he said. "What do you mean?" I replied. "Do you remember the cow?" I shuddered, hopefully not noticeable. Of course I remember the cow. Turns out, it was my turn to sacrifice a living being. A first. Up until then it was always smaller things, dead things. Now I would have to take a life. We chose an older bull. He was sick and would most likely not last the winter either way. As far as we knew, they didn't eat them, so the disease wouldn't matter towards the quality of the gift. It made it easier, but not by much. I made my way through the forest with a leash, connected in one end to my hand and in the other to Gunnar. It was a weird feeling. Gunnar had been alive longer than I. He had seen so much, from the humble beginnings of our family to the discovery of the whites. I remember wondering if he understood what was about to happen. When I looked into his eyes, I decided that he didn't. The ritual had to be performed a certain way. I began by tying the leash to a tree nearby the circle and started covering the bull with ox tallow. I removed a small pouch from my waist and dipped my fingers in its contents. Red ochre. I painted a kind of sign, which my father had taught me, on the forehead of Gunnar. If it was a letter, it was from a language I didn't know, or even had heard of. Not Latin, which would have been my go-to guess as far as sacrificial languages go, not Swedish, not Sápmi. A mystery. The knife quickly moved across the throat of the bull. Before I had time to contemplate the morality of the situation, Gunnar laid in front of me. The red in the snow was too pronounced to be ochre. Blood. I had decided to perform the kill quickly, not only for Gunnar's sake, but also for the whites. The most important step of sacrificing a living thing was the dance. We had been up late many nights practicing the moves. Father had stressed the importance of doing it correctly. My movements were jerky, just as he had shown me. It felt as if I relived the moment in the bush, watching myself. The dance was reminiscent of the final few seconds of life in an animal before death came. Sometimes it even looked like the rigor mortis after death. The dance was death, in some sense, or at least closely connected to it. I breathed a sigh of relief. The deed was done. But just as I turned around to start the walk home, I caught a glimpse of a figure halfway hiding behind a tree. Whispers in both my ears. A headache grew in my right temple. The whites stepped out into the moonlight and I saw them for the first time. Short, no taller than a meter. Its body was a shimmering mess of shapes that looked to be morphing constantly. The shape looked roughly humanoid, but it was clear to me I wasn't supposed to understand their form. Ferrofluid, that's what it looked like they were made of. Opalescent, glassy, active ferrofluid. I could have mistaken it for beauty if it wasn't for the mask it wore. At the top of the shape sat a white mask, with black rings surrounding the holes for the eyes. The eyes were of a pale, glowing yellow, and they observed me closely. There was a hole for the mouth as well, positioned in such a manner that it looked like it was frowning. And in the mouth were rows and rows of deathly, thin teeth. The white pointed at me, its arms starting to stretch. Sick. It simply said, or screeched, without moving its mouth. I ran home, terrified. When I finally got home, the house was in shambles. Furniture thrown around, shards of glass draping the wooden floor. Planks ripped straight out from the wall. And my mother was missing. I found Ingrid catatonic at the base of the stairs, and my father was comforting her. He gripped an axe tightly. Apparently, Ingrid had heard scratches on the door. She had run to tell my mother, who told her to hide. She ran up to her room, crawled under the bed, and held her breath. She heard a loud noise and the sound of 20 feet tapping. A scream, and then silence. Silence for 2 minutes, she estimated. Then, a maniacal cackle. The whites creeped around the house, looking for Ingrid. They turned every stone in the house, and came an inch away from getting her too. They had entered the room she was hiding in, at least 3, making a sound as if they were trying to smell her. A long arm started feeling the underside of the bed, and finally gripped my sister's foot. As luck would have it, my father had heard the screams and entered the house, swinging a torch and axe, just as the creature had found Ingrid. They scattered, some jumping out through open windows, some seemingly disappearing into thin air. But no sign of our mother. This was new. They had never encroached on our home before. Sure, they would make their presence known through knocking on the windows and crawling around at the edge of the forest, but never like this. Maybe safety was no longer. Father got sloppy after that dreadful morning. I never said anything, but deep down I feel like he gave up. And I was angry at him for that. He still had 2 children to take care of, even though I know he blamed me for it all. I do not know what I did wrong, still to this day. We would last 6 more months on that farm. It was dark out, but not in a normal sense. Some nights are darker than others, that I know now. In hindsight, maybe it was a sign. Pack your bags, now, get the fuck out of these godforsaken lands. Alas, I cannot change the past. Father and I were eating a silent supper, some sort of stew with a side of potatoes. Before me sat a broken man, the marks of time chipping away at the marble. Ingrid had, after our mother's presumed death, gotten into the habit of late-night walks. My father had protested, but she was relentless. Her determination reminded me of Mom. This particular July night she bursted through the door, giving my heart some trouble with keeping up. She looked distraught, horrified, but worst of all, sad. I disturbed their path, she simply stated. There were no questions. No, how do you know you stepped on one of their roads if they're invisible? No, we'll just wait and see what happens. We all knew better than to think rationally about the whites. If Ingrid knew she had walked over one of their roads, she had done so. Father stood up. Get your things. Only essentials. I need to release the animals from the barn. I do not want to give them anything for free, he said. That was a bad idea. He could just leave with us, now. Why did he have to be so stubborn? However, there was no use stopping him. Oh, how I wish I could have stopped him. He grabbed his jacket and sickle, slurped down the last of the stew in motion and ran out the door. Ingrid and I started packing. I helped her with what constituted essentials only, while trying to pack mine and also my father's bag simultaneously. Some clothes, the more knife my father had given me and one of the necklaces I had stolen. That was it, the rest would be forever left behind. There was an invisible, ticking clock hanging in the air. The dread in the air started getting thick, you could almost touch it. Where was he? 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 25 minutes. Something had gone wrong, and I had to go help him. I asked Ingrid to start the truck. She said she knew how. Then I was off to the races. I don't think I had ever, or would ever again, ran that fast. I clenched my fist around my knife and started preparing myself for what I would face. Funny enough, I could have spent my whole youth preparing for that sight and it wouldn't be enough. I entered the barn silently, and the barn seemed to respond with its own silence. No animals to speak of. He had managed to free them. But where was he now? I crouched and made my way through the building slowly. There was scattered hay and shit on the floor, but this was no time to be fancy. A weird smell emanated from the furthest corner. It was subtle at first, then stronger and finally nauseating. Rot. Death. I turned the corner and I almost threw up. Against the wall, 2 meters up, was my father. His torso separated from his head and limbs. All of his parts were nailed towards the wood in a Jesus-esque manner. But the cross wasn't connected. When I got a little bit closer, I saw that it was, in fact, connected by thin strips of flesh. A cowboy crucified. In my shock, I could only think about 2 things. How did the rot advance so quickly? And where were they? The answer to the second question would appear instantly, because they appeared instantly. They materialized from nothing. Some were hanging on my father, digging claw-like extremities into him, while covering him in ox tallow. Some were dancing beneath. Some were staring at me with empty, yellow eyes. Tens of crystalline horrors descended upon my location in desperation. They stepped on each other, pushed each other, to get to me. It was the most ancient of instincts that told me to run. So I did. They were always just a step behind. It felt like they would grab me any second, doing God knows what with me. I imagined the sharpness of their teeth. I imagined what they had behind that mask. In that moment I felt certain that if man ever gazed upon their unmasked face, he would go mad. I barely managed to get out of the barn before one of them tackled me. It pinned me to the ground and I slashed my knife at its body. The material of its body rapidly changed from solid to liquid form in the area I hit it. It floated in the air, not affected by gravity. Then it rematerialized as solid, attached to the white yet again. It had no effect. But it gave me a split second to slither out of its grip. I saw the headlights of our truck. I ran. "Where is he?" my sister desperately asked. "He's dead." "Doe." In the car, I noticed that much of what used to be my calf was missing. The whole muscle, ripped almost clean off. Someone must have been looking out for me. I don't know I possibly ran that distance in that condition otherwise. After a couple of minutes, I passed out from the pain. So, there is that. I could never quite sleep well after that night. I could swear I started hearing their whispers everywhere, the sound of their feet sneaking around, barely out of sight. But I never saw them again. They must have been tied to the land, thank everything that is holy. Both Ingrid and I carved out good lives for ourselves, but we carry this with us wherever we go. I do not know who moved up there after us. I pray they are still alive. I pray they have figured out the whites and what they mean. Otherwise, God rest their souls.